our goal should not be, having a larger GDP number. It's not necessarily a good thing. If we double the legal disputes in New York City and we hire double the amount of lawyering to do it, our legal service GDP is going to double. But that's probably not what we want. The key is to target what we want to address. So if the issue is unemployment and the hardship that it brings to people, to family, then we should address it directly. And the market is simply not a good way to address unemployment.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, research scholar and assistant professor of economics, Vincent Huang. And we're going to be talking to him in a moment about China's emerging economic challenges and his policy proposals to help solve them. As you'll hear, the Chinese economy has been steadily transitioning from a purely centrally planned system to a more market-driven one. And one of the consequences of this transition is that China now has to reckon with what Professor John T. Harvey calls the fundamental flaw in capitalism, namely that labor is a cost to business, a cost to be minimized, which incentivizes competitors in that market system to get more output for the same input, or even better, more output for less input. So this creates gains in productivity, but also in the immediate term creates unemployment. And in the absence of any countermeasures, this can then feed into structural or long-term unemployment. What seems to dominate many of the approaches to tackling this problem by governments in the Western world is a preference for the private sector to sort out what gets characterized as its own problem, because that's seen as concomitant with freedom and choice. But what the MMT framework clearly shows is that having a national currency in the first place in order to pay people to do things like keep the nation secure and have a health service and educate its population in order to solve the problems of tomorrow, the desire to want to do these things is where the MMT money story starts. The state desires to provision itself, and so in order to get people to need its currency, it imposes a tax denominated in that currency on the population, which creates people looking to do things to earn that currency, and that allows the government to spend its currency into existence to buy the things, the labor, the materials, to do the things it was put in power to do. So having a national currency in the first place is where government intervention begins, and it's a mismanagement of this power of the purse by government that creates involuntary unemployment. It turns productivity gains generated by market competition, which could be a benefit to all, into this fundamental flaw in capitalism. Because governments that control their own currency have an infinite checkbook, they are seemingly presented with two suboptimal choices. Either they can put too much spending power into the economy and risk inflation, which is costly at the ballot box, or they can leave too little spending power in the economy and force a certain percentage of people to try and survive barely subsistence wages and involuntary unemployment, which here in the UK at least is not costly at the ballot box. The Goldilocks solution advanced by MMT academics is to guarantee a job to anyone who is willing and able to work at a fixed, socially inclusive wage, which stabilizes the currency by anchoring its value to the economy's most crucial input, which is human time and labor, but more importantly, puts a floor under the minimum standard of living for everybody. And of course, seriously addressing our global climate emergency necessitates a huge transformation in how we produce and consume. But when you understand how modern money systems work, you realize it's a transformation which needn't cost our economies in terms of jobs or cost people in terms of their dignity. I think in the 21st century, freedom should mean freedom to benefit from all the things our respective nations can achieve with their modern money systems. And I also think that human ingenuity will not be spurred on by forcing some people to choose between barely subsistence wages and poverty. In the absence of a floor being put under workers' minimum pay and conditions, our so-called advanced economy's minimum bid for a human being is zero. And I'm aware I'm being ideological, but I think we could do better than that. So in a moment, we'll be talking to Vincent about his working paper on how an economically and ecologically just transition of China's economy could and should be achieved. I've linked to Vincent's proposal in the show notes, and also in the show notes, there's a link to where you can support our show via Patreon. Support starts at $1 a month. It really helps keep the show going if you're able, but of course, it's a tough time for everybody at the moment. So we're just grateful for your time and attention and your recommending us to other people. Our main aim is to get the word out and to give you some perspectives you can hopefully use to make the world a less confusing place. So thanks for listening. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm here with my pal and your pal too, Patricia Pino. Say hi, Patricia.
Hello.
And here to talk about China's economy and his policy proposal, we're joined by Vincent Huang. Vincent, welcome to the MMT podcast. How are you?
Good. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure to have you. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and how you came to MMT?
Oh, yeah. I was a cultural exchange student back in high school. So I spent 1 year in the U.S. in a public high school. I decided to come back to the U.S. for an undergraduate degree. I went to Denison University. There I majored in economics and got to know some heterodox economists. So when I graduated, I decided to pursue a PhD in economics. So I applied to UMKC, University of Missouri, Kansas City. And that was the only school that I applied to because MMT really was something that interested me. I saw great potential in it. And I knew I wanted to do something about it, with it. So I applied there, I got in, and here I am. So I now teach at the University of Denver in Colorado, US. And I just wrote a couple papers. One is a policy note, the other a working paper on the Chinese economy and how MMT could be used in China.
Can you remember the thought that switched the MMT light bulb on for you at the moment you came across it, or was it just always there? Because, I mean, a lot of the time we'll be talking to people who've been going down a very orthodox route, and then somebody goes, here, read Bill Mitchell, and then bang, there it is.
A big bang moment.
Yeah, I definitely remember that moment vividly. It was 2008, I believe, when the great financial crisis was happening. And at the time, I was taking a class, Money and Banking, with Fadl Kaboub, right? And so I remembered that one class, he was talking about the colonial Africa's case, how its economy was monetized, right? And how British pounds was introduced as part of this imposition of a tax liability. And that really blew my mind. And it was that moment I thought, oh, there's something great here, because here's a case that demonstrates to you that, money isn't the constraint, right? Real resources are the constraint, and that we can do great things if we know how this works. And, before that, I've taken many economic classes that have taught me many, mainstream ideas about government budget and money and banking. So it was really refreshing to see that alternative perspective.
We've had Fadel here as a guest.
Obviously. Oh, nice. Yeah.
He's wonderful. But in 2008, he was already fully subscribed to MMT, right? Or was it a journey?
He went to UMKC, right? Which was why I went there, and that was the only school that I applied to. He taught at Denison. I was fortunate enough to be one of the first students that he sent to UMKC himself.
Oh, okay.
So when I met my advisor, right, Matthew Forstetter, and the first thing he said to me was, "So you're a Fadl student?" I said, "Yes." And then he was like, well, Fado was my first PhD student, so you are like my grandson. Yeah. So that's a family tree.
Yeah, we can trace it all back.
Yeah. And Fado does some work with the Tunisian economy, right? So he was already applying MMT to developing countries. And because the earlier MMT works were mainly done in the US and some other developed countries. So I thought he was making some important contribution to diversify MMT. And I knew I wanted to do something about MMT with China. So yeah, so that's sort of the connection there.
Great. Well, so in a minute, we'll talk about the working paper, which is called Chinese Green Job Guarantee, a Roadmap for Sustainable Prosperity. But let's set the scene. So I understand from reading the paper, the Chinese economy has been undergoing a steady transformation for a few years now. Could you describe the Chinese economy for non-Chinese people?
To be honest, I don't think many Western people understand Chinese economy at all. So, is it socialist? Is it capitalist? Can you tell us, where these diverge maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, part of my doctoral dissertation is to elaborate this alternative Chinese economic model. It's complicated because it's not just about economic arrangements, right? Certain practices. It's a very cultural and historical thing. So yes, as you said, Patricia, many have, some people said China is communist, socialist. Some will tell you it's a capitalist country, right? It doesn't get more capitalistic than China. I would say that it's probably the best to describe China as a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, right? This is the official language that the state uses. Normally people say, well, they're just saying it. They're actually practicing capitalism and all that, but it's really not true. It's quite nuanced. Now, without getting too much into the details, so I often use this example to illustrate the differences between the Chinese system and sort of the Western, more laissez-faire system, right? So in the US, the question we tend to ask is this: given the primacy of the market, right, that the market always exists, we ask the question how much proper state intervention is necessary or needed. This has the implication that we see the state as a necessary evil, right? And sometimes for good reasons. Okay, but in China, the question we ask is very different. Given that the state or any collective authority must exist to maintain order, what kind of a market would be best to fulfill the developmental vision of the state? So the question we ask are fundamentally different, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there are important cultural and historical, continuances in each of those questions, right? So in the US, we see the state as a necessary evil, and we take individual freedom as the utmost important value, right? In China, we take collective order as the most important value, and that most Chinese today don't have a problem with balancing this collective order and individual freedom, right? To them, it's a spontaneous conformity kind of thing, to borrow Adolf Lowe's concept, right? It's not necessarily a contradiction. You have to have one and not the other, and that you have to have this role to serve them kind of thing. So it's a very different cultural and dynamic, and consequently, many of the things that the Chinese take as something usual or natural are taken in a very different light, interpreted very differently in the West. So there is that part. Yeah.
So you start with the state, and then the state allows as much as market individual freedom as seem necessary for allowing the state to fulfill its objectives. Is that?
It's more so that the ultimate goal is from a humanitarian perspective, right, to achieve that freedom and liberty and all that. But the way to achieve it, right, the way to achieve it are quite different in different societies, I think. And for Chinese, I can't speak for all of the Chinese, but perhaps it's a Confucianist value, right, that's been underpinning the Chinese social and political structure for thousands of years, that we see collective order as the basis for individuals to be liberated, to be free. Mm-hmm. right? How would you be free if you cannot walk at 3 p.m. on the street in some big cities? Wouldn't you like to have some collective order to ensure that you have this individual freedom to do that, right? And that, of course, brings out a whole lot of other issues, the surveillance camera system, right? And all of that, right? Mm-hmm. But anything I read from the West, it simply doesn't present that alternative explanation. It looks at China's surveillance system and say, okay, the Communist Party is spying on people.
The thing about that here, that particular point, is that we have surveillance systems here as well. It's just that they're almost like kept secret.
This is the first time I'm hearing about this. We're talking to each other through a surveillance system.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Not too long ago, New York Times had a couple tweets in the same day, and they are 20 minutes apart. One tweet said that China's effort to lock down, to contain the coronavirus has come with a great cost of human liberty.
Oh, yeah, I saw that, yeah.
20 minutes later, there's another tweet saying that Italy is locking down Milan and other cities to protect Europe.
Vincent, are you saying that there's an institutional bias in the mass media?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it's intertwined with racism.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Understatement of the century, yeah.
We can go on and on about it. But I think it's important to recognize these, real structural things that we're dealing with. And I think those also have, implications for whether MMT could be successful in different cultures and societies.
So in that light then, because China always seemed to me like someone who wasn't too concerned about how the Western world thought about it, to be honest. And then in your paper, I thought that one of the first paragraphs said that, was it a Chinese politician that was actually using the Eurozone deficit restrictions as a justification for keeping the Chinese deficit low? And that came as a bit of a surprise. Is that usual for Chinese politicians to do?
Well, first of all, I should say that there is a diverse opinions out there. But here's the thing, for China, a country that has pursued quote unquote modernization, right, for decades. And for a long time, modernization was equated to westernization, right? So a lot of the ideas and scientific findings, right, and economics being an important social discipline, they impacted the thinking of many Chinese intellectuals. Right. So if you go to China today, if you take some university level courses, you see a lot of 99% of the mainstream economics out there. It's not surprising from a theoretical understanding point of view that you would find Chinese politicians speaking in those lights. And those are probably the politicians that are trained as economists. Okay, because people who are not trained as economists usually
they're better at economics.
Are feel better, right, with the deficit to GDP ratio and all that. So you're observing the same struggle all over the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had hopes for China. I was hoping China would save us from this deficit addiction, but...
You mean surplus addiction, right?
Yeah, surplus addiction.
Surplus fetish.
Well, China is in a position that politically it's leaning to the left, especially as Xi comes into power. So even though economically, at the theoretical level, it's leaning to the right, which is more mainstream neoclassical, there are certain things it still has to do in order to fulfill sort of a more politically leftist agenda, such as the Made in China 2025, such as the industrial upgrading, the supply side structural reform, right? All of those political agendas require corresponding economic policies. And those economic policies are not mainstream, right? So that's the part that counters some of the influence of mainstream economics in Chinese policymaking.
So before we dive into the paper, just wanted to ask your take on the China-US trade war. Warren Mosler would say, what Trump did with tariffs was to say to China, you're not charging us enough for stuff. I'm imposing a tariff. Now it's more expensive for Americans to buy the stuff from China. Who's winning? Who's losing? I mean, what's your take on that?
I actually taught a class on trade wars and agreements just recently, and I used the US-China case as a case study. I think the trade war is only a very small part of the conflict between the two countries. So it's hard to comment on the trade war strictly from the perspective of a trade war, right? It's not just a trade war, it's also the technology war, legal war, media war, currency war. And as you probably have seen, the US has also played a Taiwan card, Xinjiang card, Tibet card, right? It's a whole package of efforts that started in late 2017 and early 2018, when several important US documents made it clear that the number one threat to the US dominance is no longer terrorism, but superpower rivalry. And in all of those documents, it makes clear that Russia and China are the only two rivals. And in the long run, it's only China, because Russia is trapped in this resource curse, right? So since then, there have been a combination of efforts from the US side to sort of contain China's rise. And trade war was one, right? Steve Bannon, right, I'm sure you are familiar with him and his ideas, have said publicly that he saw the US having 5 years left to contain China. And after that, there is no opportunity to do that anymore. So I expect to see this intense, conflictual relationship between US and China for the next 5 to 10 years. But maybe after that, there will be a repositioning happen, then things might get better.
And what would that look like? After 5 years, what happens? Does everybody start using the yuan or something?
There's one thing that would shock the world when that day comes. The IMF, according to its constitution, would base its headquarters in the country that has the most GDP, right? The most nominal GDP, right? Because based on purchasing power parity, China already surpassed the US back in 2015, I believe. So when China surpassed the US in nominal GDP, the IMF would have to relocate to Beijing. I don't know how people would respond to that, would feel about it. Changes are happening inevitably. And as social scientists, we're terrible at predicting things. I don't know how things would transpire, but I do hope that at the minimum, we have the MAD, right? The mutual assured destruction going on for both countries because of the nuclear capabilities. So I hope this conflict would resolve in a way that is more peaceful than others. I don't think the two countries would get into a hot war just for fighting who's the number one. It doesn't make too much sense at all. But I do think it's important for both countries to specify their core interests so that, mistakes won't be made in that sense.
All right. Well, let's set the scene for the paper now.
That was all introduction.
Let's just put a pin in that, put a pin in the old nuclear war thing there. Let's just... nice cup of tea, sort it out. So last bit of context then. So some people might be surprised to know that there is unemployment in China, because you've got good old market forces moving in their mysterious way. And it's a lot of people. How many people are we talking about, Vincent?
1.4 billion, right? If you only included the mainland China. And if I wanted to be more politically correct, I would include people from Taiwan. And
that's not the number of unemployed people, though.
No. My estimate is 24 million people.
Right, yeah.
As a percentage, what percentage is that?
That would account for 5.2% urban unemployment. So overall, it would be about 3% unemployment for both urban and rural, right? And it's important to specify whether it's urban or rural unemployment because of China's special land ownership system. If you are of a rural origin, you cannot be unemployed because presumably you can always work on the land to provide a livelihood. So it's only urban Chinese that could be unemployed. Right. So in the paper, I use that urban unemployment as the conservative estimate for China's unemployment number, which is 24 million, still a big number.
I can see that measure catching on in this country as well,
as
a way to massage the stats. So, if you don't live in a city, you're not unemployed anyway. You can have an allotment, So if you're an unemployed person in China, what are unemployment benefits like? Do they exist?
Yeah, there is some social assistance for unemployed urban workers. It has a time limit to it. Now, there is the minimum sort of living standard subsidies, right? That if your income don't meet a certain criteria, you would be receiving that income, but it's very small. And especially now that the overall education of the population has increased, right? Now you not only have unemployment, but also underemployment. And also you see cases, a lot of younger people who were discouraged from the kind of jobs that they can find in the market. And they rather stay at home. As the only child, that their parents sometimes allow that to happen. And one thing to note is that you mentioned something, why does China have this many unemployment with this increasingly sophisticated market system, right? Something that you should know is that China did not have any unemployment in socialist era. Unemployment increased as China become more marketized. So market is never really the solution. It's the cause, if you look at it historically, to China's unemployment. There is no reason for firms to guarantee full employment in the economy if it doesn't make sense for them to do that, right? They only hire you if you generate an output that can be sold for a profit. The problem today in China is that we have excess capacity, not enough demand. And it's bound to happen because technology continues to advance, labor productivity continues to rise, and it always comes to a point where you have excess capacity, not just excess machines, but also excess labor. And it becomes particularly problematic in a monetary society that people have to depend on jobs to provision, right, to stay alive. So if you don't have a job, and you know that in the long run, automation is going to replace many of the jobs, how do we as a society manage this social provisioning process? That's a problem that is facing not just China, but also everyone, the humanity.
So in your paper, you use Okun's law to measure China's lost output coming off of this 24 million people unemployed. Could you say what Okun's law is?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So Okun's law, first of all, it's a theoretical model that says we have two things that are correlated: GDP growth and unemployment rate, right? When unemployment rate decreases, GDP growth should increase because more people are working and more production, and therefore GDP growth rate should go up, and vice versa, right? So it doesn't matter what direction it is, they are correlated. So Okun, in his first paper, said that there's an Okun ratio of 2, right, between GDP growth and unemployment rate reduction. So 1% of unemployment rate reduction will lead to 2% growth in GDP. That's the rough estimate, right? So people have used, different countries, different geographies to estimate what the Okun's law would be for their time and space. So that's one way to do it. So in the paper, I used 2 ways. One is the Okun law. The other one is the average product method. They end up suggesting that the GDP loss from unemployment for China is roughly 3 to 4 percentage points.
So that's the scale of the problem. And you do a sectoral balance analysis to show what MMTers know, which is that every deficit has to add up to some other sector or some other combination of sectors surplus. The Chinese sectoral balance chart tells a story. The Chinese private sector's surplus has been declining since 2015. Could you say why that is?
Yeah, mainly because the exports as a percentage of GDP has decreased, right? There's some increase. It's partly offset by the government deficit as percentage of GDP. That has increased a little bit, but it's not enough.
Is that fair to say that, because that's something that I see in other developing countries as well, like exports lead to growth, then people become wealthier, and that then puts pressure more on home consumption, and then that in turn decreases inputs. Is that a fair assessment, or is it far more complicated than that?
It is more complicated than that. If you look at China's economic growth history, it did not really grow out of an export-led model. It grew out of a internal investment-led model. So for decades, China's investment as percentage of GDP was around 30%. If you look at Japan, South Korea, when they experience their most rapid growth periods, it's all when their fixed investment to GDP ratio exceeds 20 or 25%. The difference is that China was able to sustain it for a very long period of time. And the reason is because investment in China was partially socialized. It's undertaken by the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises. They have many more considerations than simply maximizing profits, right? So infrastructure works were undertaken not because it's, so profit maximizing for the SOEs, but simply because the state mandated you have to do it. It's good for the economy. You have to build up your infrastructure. So even if you eliminate any trade relationship between China and the US, right? This goes back to the trade war thing that we briefly discussed. China's GDP would probably suffer anywhere between 0.5 to 1 percentage points growth rate, right? Not even the aggregate number. And for the US, it's even less. Economists tend to overstate the impact of the trade war from an economic point of view. It's actually not that much, especially if you consider the value added in China's export. iPhones are exported from China to the US, but how much money, like how much value added Chinese firms get in this whole chain of production is actually quite small. It's a very small percentage points. So that's why, Apple products should be exempted from the tariffs, because if you impose tariffs on iPhones, you're actually taxing California designer who has the most value added in the production. So I think that's a myth. There is this, relentless push for neoliberalism for many decades by now, and the economic prescriptions they give is to liberalize your economy, embrace free trade, attract FDI, foreign direct investments. But if you look at China, that's not the case, right? China's FDI to GDP never really exceeded 2%, except for a couple of years. That was due to East Asian real estate investment boom. But other than that, it adopted a restrictive FDI policies intentionally. China is a very interesting case that debunks a lot of mainstream economic principles, I think, partly that, right? And many said that, well, it's cheap labor, but come on, there are a lot more cheaper labors than China, right? India has cheap labor. Africa, it's not just cheap labor, right? So now people are saying, okay, it's the infrastructure. And I think that's true, right? Infrastructure are important. Educational infrastructure is also very important. And if you look at that, well, China certainly has those too, right? But who's doing the infrastructure investment? It's the state. It's the SOEs, right? So maybe it appears that the state budget isn't that progressive in the sense that the deficit isn't that large. But remember, a lot of the spendings are being done by the SOEs. It's on their balance sheet, right? So the true size of China's deficit is actually much larger than what we are seeing on paper. Although I still think they could increase it.
Well, unemployment would suggest they can increase it, right?
Yeah, you see, the problem is that this traditional economic growth to employment growth method simply doesn't work. China did its own estimate back in 2013. And the idea is that if you want to create 1.5 million new jobs, you have to increase your GDP growth by 1 percentage points, which is unrealistic, right? Because we have 24 million urban unemployment. If you want to address that, that means China's GDP needs to grow at additional 16%, right? So that means that China in 2019 would have needed to grow on 22% to reach full employment. This is by the conventional stimulus methods, right, to get to full employment. It's just unfeasible, which is why I think a job guarantee makes much more sense. Because with the job guarantee, you create job first, and economic growth comes naturally. Increased consumption and the multiplier effect and all of that.
Just before we get into the job guarantee thing, I was going to ask you, when you do your sectoral analysis, sectoral balances, you do an extra step, you break it down into 4 sectors. So you break down the government surplus deficit into local government versus central government. And there's an interesting quirk there that you don't see it in Britain or Greece or the USA. Could you say what that is? You've got a difference there between municipalities and states might have a balanced budget amendment. They actually have to spend within their means because they're currency users. But Chinese local governments are doing something different there.
Exactly. Yeah. If you look at the data, now it doesn't include the transfer payments from the central to the local governments. If we were to include that, the local government deficit would, as a percentage of GDP, would decrease a bit. Even if we include that, the local governments as a whole in China runs about a 3% deficit to GDP ratio, which is huge, right? The Chinese central government runs about 2%. Yeah. Its local government runs about 3%, right? China also earns about 2% surplus from exports, right? From the trade surplus, right? So that created the 7% surplus to GDP ratio for the Chinese private sector, right? That's where all of that add up to. But it is interesting that In the US, we have the Orange County defaulted before, the state of California defaulted before, right? The local and municipal governments are bound by their tax revenues, right? They cannot spend beyond their means, or they have to sell assets, land and whatever. But in China, the situation is different, because you see there is this one party system, right? But the way to get promoted within the party is by having a good record. Say if you were governing a locality and its GDP growth during your term has increased a lot higher than your previous term, you got a much higher chance to get promoted within the Communist Party, right? If you look at Xi, if you look at all of the previous Chinese leaders, they all governed places that has a lot of population, and they all had impressive economic growth records, right? Xi was the governor of Shanghai and Zhejiang province, one of the richest province in China, that grew rapidly during his term. So they have this incentive, right? By political design, they have the incentive to take on more local government debt, right? To spur local economic growth. And it's okay because all of the loans they're taking out are from the Chinese SOEs, state-owned banks. Okay, so effectively, the local government debt are a part of the central government debt. Central government owns those SOE banks. So it's an interesting arrangement that we are seeing here.
So let me just recap that. So you're saying that they borrow from banks that are owned by the state, and in effect, are those loans then guaranteed by the state? Is this equivalent to the central bank simply financing local governments directly?
I think it's similar, although I don't find any written down procedures regarding the operation of these things. But effectively, what happens is that the SOEs guarantee the financing of local government spending, right? So they are the sort of the buyer of last resort for your local government bonds. Okay, so they finance your spending, and when the loan comes to maturity, they simply roll over.
So it's a pretty decentralized system then. I mean, it's far more decentralized than the one we have here.
I think so. It's a system that has worked well, that gives the local officials the power to do what is best for its localities, right? So whether it's to develop tourism, to develop industry, to attract investments, right? They have the financial resources to pursue their goals, right? Whether that works or not depends on the results. And if it does work, whoever was in charge would probably get promoted. So it's a huge experimental field, if you wish, in China, that you observe all of these local differences, right? But then at the central level, it crafts national industrial plans, right? That's the 5-year plans that they do every 5 years. So it's an interesting combination of central guiding, right? Indicative planning. In economics, sometimes we call that. And then at the local level, you have these local experimentations and practices. They even experimented with healthcare system reform by setting up all of these experimental points at different places in the country. And surprisingly, it's one city with the poorest GDP, with the lowest GDP, that seems to have done it the best. And it turns out that it's a socialist medical system. Yeah. So I think in terms of this connection between the political and the economic, they figure out a way that promotes pragmatism, right? And I think that's important because you want things that works to stay in place, to get promoted, right? And not to be confined in some ideological debates.
So it sounds like all you need to do is persuade one of these local authorities to introduce a job guarantee, and then everybody else will copy them, right?
We're kind of skipping ahead.
I'm getting too excited about it.
What I was going to ask you later on was, you were saying you would want to introduce it incrementally. That was your proposal. But we'll get to that later on. But that's kind of the answer to that question that I had for you, which was why the incrementalism. But I think you've answered that, really. The conclusion of your analysis could be summed up in this passage. You crunch the numbers and then you come to this conclusion. In a nutshell, the job growth creates GDP growth is functional, whereas GDP growth creates job growth is inefficient. Can you just underline why that is?
Yeah. So first of all, the GDP growth to job growth is inefficient because it would have required 22% GDP growth rate to eliminate China's 24 million urban unemployment alone. Right. So that's simply not feasible. Even ecologically, it's not going to be ideal, I think. The other way around, I think it's emphasizing something in the development economics literature that I think is important is this distinction between growth versus development, right? Our goal should not be, having a larger GDP number. It's not necessarily a good thing, right? If we double the legal disputes in New York City and we hire double the amount of lawyering to do it, our legal service GDP is going to double. But that's probably not what we want. The key is to target what we want to address. So if the issue is unemployment, right, and the hardship that it brings to people, to family, then we should address it directly. And the market is simply not a good way to address unemployment. If anything, market creates the tendency for automation, for labor displacing technical change that will make unemployment worse and worse over time, that will make people taking on jobs, right, that do not reflect their skills, right? So I think, why not create jobs first, right? And we know that we can create jobs because fundamentally unemployment is an absurd concept. Right? Someone is willing, able, and ready to contribute, but somehow he or she is not allowed to. Why? Just because it's not profitable? Just because it doesn't add up? It doesn't contribute to the profit account at the end of the day? It doesn't make that much sense. Now, in a monetary production economy, given the society that we live in is profit-oriented, then we should utilize the state finances in a way that could address the issues that we have, that doesn't necessarily alter or demolish the system we have overnight, right? So if profit is a game, okay, let's play it. So how do we do it? Well, the state effectively can be the buyer of last resort, right? It can buy all labors, put them into use. And when laborers have money, they spend. And that's the private sector getting the benefits from labor's consumption. Right. So if this is a game we have to play in order to address unemployment, let's play it. And that's my idea here. Right. So I don't think a job guarantee is necessarily the solution to everything. But I think given the economic and political climate that we have today, it's probably the closest to solving some short-term and medium-term pain, which are really real. Right. And then what's worse than being exploited is not being exploited, i.e. unemployment. So
that was great. Just lay it out for us then. If your job guarantee scheme is enacted and you become unemployed because of the wonderful market, what happens? Where do you go? How much do you get? What kind of jobs are we talking about?
Yeah, so I think as a principle, the jobs that are created should complement the deficiency of the market, right? So there are certain things that the markets don't reward because it's not profitable, such as environmental sustainability, right? It could be the opposite, right? It's more profitable to exploit the environment, right? So it should be jobs that target the deficiencies of the economy that we're looking at. And for the Chinese economy, there are certain categories of jobs that I have in mind that I proposed. One is the green jobs, right? This is probably the most obvious. In the course of its economic development and economic growth, really, China has also experienced rapid environmental degradation and crisis. But in recent years, especially since 2005, when the renewable energy law was passed in China, I think there is an attempt to sort of synthesize economic growth and environmental sustainability. So I think a green job would be ideal, right? In policy-wise, in terms of feasibility, I think it makes a lot of sense. It addresses a urgent need within the Chinese economy, within China's environment. Plus, green jobs are also more labor intensive, right? So they themselves don't create too much pollution in their work. The second type I have in mind was called the cultural preservation jobs, right? This actually goes back to our discussion earlier about how China's modernization entailed westernization, right? And this globalization also brings conflicts. And if you look at the mainstream values, it's the Hollywood values that's being exported all over the world. In a Hollywood movie, It's all about a brave individual fighting against this evil big government, right? And then somehow succeeded, right? And it promotes a certain sort of value and ideology. And I think at the same time also constrain the possibilities for alternatives in Western societies, right? Now, all of these exported through the Hollywood impacted the rest of the world. And I think it's important for Chinese today to be confident in their own system, in their own culture, and in their alternative path that they're taking, right? And I think it's important for them to find sort of a balance, right, between the Western civilization and thinking and values and their own. So I think maybe a cultural preservation job program could, achieve that, whether it's to finding out local craftsmen, right, and their practices, that how they do their work, or to dig deeper into the Chinese traditional culture and find its contemporary relevancy, right? I think there's value in that as well, especially helpful for the college graduates that did not major in STEM. So China has roughly 50 to 60% of college graduates that major in mathematics, science, engineering, and all of that. And there was a big, state effort behind it. But what about the people who are not engineers, who are not scientists, not mathematicians, right? Maybe, they could be hired to work on these, in these cultural preservation programs that utilize their skills, right? That also brings meaning to their lives. And also, obviously, other, life-enhancing jobs. Okay, so organizing community-based service programs, right? The elderlies, the stay-at-home children, right? When their parents move into cities for jobs. So there are a lot of things that needs to be done, right? That will bring tremendous value to people and to the country. Why don't we do it? So I think job guarantee would have a role to play as long as there are things that needs to be done. Unless we enter into an age where robots can do everything and there's absolutely nothing we could do to make our lives better off.
And the robots take over.
Then maybe there's a job guarantee to fight against the robots.
You can always start a ministry of what shall we do now?
Exactly. The key is to ask the right question, right? It's not whether we can, it's what we should be doing. It's mind-boggling because somehow we have this notion that, only rich country can afford it, right? Well, look at China. China was extremely poor by any GDP standards. When it opened up its economy in 1978, where did it get the money from to invest in all of those infrastructure? Somehow they could do it when they were poor, right? But when they're richer now, neoclassical and mainstream economists come in and tell you, no, you can't do it. You have to hit that, magic number to be a fiscally responsible nation. So
it's just like coming out of a Great Depression into a world war for the Americans, and you go, well, there's no money. All of a sudden, no, there's loads of money. There's all the money we need. In fact, our problem is inflation.
And I think from this coronavirus, we all of a sudden realize that we have all the money that we need, right? The U.S. just announced $2 trillion stimulus and $1 trillion on the way. So in total, $3 trillion.
I thought they were borrowing that from you. That's what they say.
Yeah, you personally, Vincent.
Yeah. What do they say in China? I mean, if America is borrowing all the dollars from China, where is China? In China, they must have an equivalent. Where is China borrowing their yuan from? What's the story?
They probably think that because we export more, right? We are in a credited position. It's hard to make sense of something that is not logical, right? But I think you bring up an interesting point earlier about in the future what will we be using, the U.S. dollars or the Chinese RMB, the Chinese yuan? And I think if the Chinese state is determined to promote the internationalization of RMB, it needs to increase central government deficits to issue more RMB denominated bonds. Right, because right now there's a severe shortage of RMB bonds. There are RMB local government bonds, but those are not going to be enough to attract international investors. So if you want to push for internationalization of RMB, you actually need to spend more. And ideally, you should be in a trade deficit position to do that.
The way America has been running deficits.
Exactly. And
So
then
that's the
China
next stage.
in this process, China has actually helped to solidify the US dollar dominance.
Oh. See, working against itself.
We accept the US dollars, and we always reinvest it back to Wall Street. That created a stable US dollar exchange rate regime.
The Americans, they just think they're losing the whole thing all the time, don't they? They tell their population, "Oh, we're losing here." It's like, how are you losing?
In real terms, they're winning, right?
Yeah.
In financial terms, they're losing on papers.
Just paper.
But they also lost in terms of industry, in terms of jobs that relate to industry, right? Because in the past several decades, America has experienced a hollowing out of industries. Right. Oftentimes,
it has pursued it, though. This has been actively pursued. This is
exactly. It's higher value added in what they're doing now, right? I think for a nation, it's strategically unsound to abandon your industry just because it's not that profitable. And I think there are a lot more consideration going into it. There should be, but as I often say it, in the U.S., there's only one party, the business party, so decisions are not necessarily that long-term or, beneficial to the nation as a whole.
Okay, there's two wings to the business party, though, You can choose the red business party or the blue business party.
We have choice here. We have choice.
Yeah, we got that. We got that in the UK as well.
You're free to do that. Yeah.
I remember talking to Rowan Gray maybe a couple of years ago. Do you know Rowan?
Right.
From Modern Money Network, yeah. We were talking about the job guarantee was just starting to heat up over there because AOC was starting to get some media and it was starting to get talked about. And then, of course, it was always in Bernie's platform.
Right.
But then the more sort of centrist Democrats started going, oh, yeah, I was for a job guarantee the whole time. And so it was in the news. So we were having a conversation with Rowan about the job guarantee. And he said, yeah, some of the more centrist candidates are talking about an incremental rollout in the states. Let's trial it in this state or this locality. And to his mind, he was like, I don't think that's going to be healthy because he sort of likened it to the school system. He said a couple of 100 years ago, you just said, whether the school system rises or falls is going to be based on whether it works out in these two little places here. I would say that's not a good way to conduct the test. It's almost designed to fail at that point rather than going, well, look, should this just be like in the basic suite of human rights that we've got that, every child gets a place in school. And so that's how he wanted to talk about the job guarantee. Look, is it a right or not? I think it is, or, jobs for all that want them. Whereas you are saying, actually, an incremental rollout in China would be quite good because, and again, you put me straight. What I'm hearing you say is that you've got a culture that's more directed to like, actually, we want this to work. So let's trial it here. And yeah, it won't be perfect, but we trial it in the next region. We'll be one step closer to perfecting it. Whereas if you did it in a different culture like the UK or the US, it'd be like, look, the powers that be will throw everything at the wall trying to get it to fail so they could go, right, let's go back to business as usual, unemployment, precarious workers and rubbish wages.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think you brought up something really important here, which is that even though it's a good idea, even though we all know that it could work, it's not going to be applied the same in every place. And frankly, I'm quite pessimistic about its success probability in the US. Right? I'm not as familiar with the UK as with the US political climate, but I remember when the Green Job Guarantee, the Green New Deal was being proposed, right? The major news outlets invited people to talk about it. And if you look at the people they invited, it's not the MMT people, right? It's rarely someone who actually knows MMT that gets to talk about MMT on the television. So as a consequence, you get a very different image. I used to think that, once the capitalists, once the business recognize that MMT is actually good for them, in the sense that, every dollar that workers would get spent, right, which becomes their profits, they would be on board with it. But increasingly so, I don't think that anymore. And so, I think that the question in the US is quite a ideological one at this point, which is kind of disappointing to see for me. Whereas I think the reason I propose a gradualist approach to a job guarantee in China is because I see the Chinese state as being intensely pragmatic over the years, right? Intensely pragmatic over the years. And this has many, implications, not just economic policy, but also its political institution and arrangements, right? Very few people know that the Chinese Communist Party have been reforming itself continuously. And every economic policies has always been experimented and trialed before it becomes nationwide, before it becomes adopted, right? I think there is great value in that because gradualism to me is pragmatism, right? You can change organizations overnight. You cannot change people's habit of thought, routines of behavior, or we call it institution, right? So organization can change overnight, institutions cannot. It takes gradual adjustments of the institutions.
You mean
right?
the
So I think for some, this part is not cultural, right, as much, because I think for a policy to be successfully implemented, it needs to take a pragmatic approach. So in the US, we see that the states are less capable of handling a job guarantee, right? Partly because it's constrained by its own budget. And then at the federal level, the discussion largely becomes an ideological debate, right? Every time you bring up Green New Deal, a job guarantee, people call you socialist. And it's true. It is a socialist policy, right? It could undermine the power position of the capitalists in the hiring process, in the job market. It gives laborers more power because it gives labor more options. So it is a socialist policy. But the question is, why not socialism? That's a question I would ask. But unfortunately, I think the time isn't ripe yet in the US or in the West. And I hate to say this, but Bernie Sanders got a real shot, right, 4 years ago, and this time as well. But Democrats rather see Trump win than getting Bernie Sanders in power.
Yeah.
Right. So if they didn't know any better 4 years ago, right, when it was Clinton versus Sanders, they should know better this time between Biden and Sanders, but they make the same decision. Right. So I really don't think I'm much less optimistic about a job guarantee being implemented in the US, simply because I don't see the mechanism to make that work. The political cultural climate are so hostile right now, right? That we have this rise in populism, that there has been this anti-intellectual movement for decades, right? That resulted in the situation that we see today, from our top political leader to the day-to-day conversations you would have with people. So I'm not optimistic about it. But for China, I'm actually optimistic because it's a one-party system. The party is accountable for basically everything it does, good or bad. It has a internal need to stabilize the society. And if providing full employment is something that would create social stability, I think the Communist Party would be on board with it. So that's the positive side.
That's what I was going to ask you just before. We're winding up now, Vincent. But I was going to ask you, how important are green politics and green growth to the Chinese government as an institution? And the same question about the Chinese people. Is there alignment or is there a divide?
I think on the issue of environmental protection, the state and the civil societies are on board. One thing about environmental pollution is that it affects everyone roughly equally, right? There are geographical complications, but when you get a bad environment, everyone gets affected, whether it's President Xi or, the most ordinary people live in the village, right? So there is that incentive. I think a few years ago, there was a survey and it showed that environmental protest is the number 2 cause of social protest in China, right? So the state recognizes that it needs to do something about it, especially as a few years ago, Beijing had this smog that became quite famous, that you couldn't see another person a few meters away, It's a UK, so meters is fine. And now things have gotten a lot better, right? If you go to Beijing today, you don't see that.
Because of the crisis, or is that
even before the crisis, right?
Okay.
Now, the other thing that's interesting about the Chinese economic system is that in every 5-year plan that it crafts, right, it conducts extensive surveys to get feedbacks from the people about what is working, what is not working, what needs to be improved, and that gets crafted into the 5-year plan. And that is why if you look at the consulting companies in China, right, including the international consulting company like McKinsey, right, usually their biggest clients are the Chinese local or state governments, right? They pay these companies to do surveys, and that's a way of getting people's opinions and make it matter in the planning process. So environmental protection issues is certainly one important thing, right? That gets feedback to the state, and the state also recognizes it, right? Because the political center in China is in Beijing. When you see the Beijing smog, you know something is not working.
Sorry, is the state quite fearful of protests then? Is that their main kind of drive for change?
Or populism? Is populism a threat even?
I think populism is always a threat to any political regime, right? And I think at the end of the day, the discussion we should have is good governance versus bad governance. So if you're asking if the Communist Party is fearful of bad governance that will lead to protesting and social unrest, then sure, that's the fear that they should have, right? And I think they've had that in mind, and that's being reflected in their effort to pursue higher and higher growth, whether that's for the better or for the worse, and that's in their pursuit for rethinking this market reform, right? Because many critiques would say that China's problem is not that it hasn't reformed enough; it's that it's reformed too much down to this market route, right? And so there has been, for example, the most recent important rethinking is on China's healthcare reform, right? Before, people argue that it's gone too far to the marketized route. And now we know that the socialist era, we got a pretty good healthcare system, even though we were poor. Why don't we bring it back, right? It's this kind of thinking that is grounded in the Chinese state's need to make its population happy that gives me the confidence that they would make right decisions more often than not. Because they are being held accountable, right? They're being held accountable. That's simple. Whereas in the US, I'm afraid that the situation we have is elect and regret, right? Where you get someone into power and you're stuck with it. And you can't really complain because you make the decision.
Oh, even better, you get to say, all right, well, let's have another election. And then you vote again, you vote for the blue version of who you just had. And they go, there you go, you're all free. You did this to yourselves, you guys.
Well, I should make it clear that I do see substantial differences between the Democrats and the Republican parties, right? But it is interesting to compare the U.S. political system to China's, right? And see how that intertwine with their different economic systems. And frankly, I think the Chinese model has worked quite well. It's just that it has not been interpreted. It has not been elaborated well enough, right? So much so that nowadays when people look at China's success story, they say, oh, China succeeded because it opened up its market in 1978. Well, guess what? There's a lot of countries that open up their markets, right? The last country that did it the best was Venezuela, right?
That didn't go very well.
That didn't go really well. Right? But if you look at the economies that have actually succeeded in the past several decades, these are all of the economies that put a strong emphasis on the role of the state. China, Japan, South Korea, and now Vietnam. And actually quite interesting because they are all Confucianist states, right? So I think there is something there, right? And I think it's important for the U.S. to learn the lessons that it could, right? It's just that we are not doing that, right? If anything, the U.S. is in this fighting stage. So it's not, giving China its credit, right? Instead, it says that every success of the Chinese economy is due to theft, right? It's due to, I don't know. I mean, those things.
It's very partisan view of the whole situation. I don't think we get a fair assessment of China here at all from our economic commentators or.
Well, think about the couple of tweets that we saw from the New York Times, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how could they do that on the same day, 20 minutes apart? If that's okay, and then people do seem to be on board with it, I mean, if anything simply reduces to, they are the commies and we are the, freedom advocates, and then we move very little forward.
Yeah.
No.
It just breeds misunderstanding and unnecessary hatred oftentimes.
Well, that's why this has been just a great conversation, just to be able to just get on the inside there and, get the ideology out of the way and just hear from you, like what's really going on there. It's there's a lot to learn.
Well, I don't know that I have the answer for you on everything about China, but I do think that it's important to spread those different perspectives out there, right? But right now, our stories, our understanding about China is so simple. It's simple. I get it. It's comfortable, right? To know that, it's just a fluke or it's whatever. There's an author that writes the book, The Coming Collapse of China, right? It's a Taiwanese lawyer that gets to speak in Congress quite often. If that's the image, if that's the conclusion that congressmen in the US are hearing about China, then their understanding about China is deeply flawed. It doesn't help, frankly, from the US core interest point of view, to craft foreign policies with China, right? At the minimum, you should know your enemy.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they should be enemies, but come on, it's not even doing a good job in that sense.
It's like deceiving yourself, and...
It is. And if you look at Trump's decision to start a trade war against China, he found the author that wrote a book on Amazon, right? That says, basically trade war is easy to do and it's easy to win. And then let's do it. It's mind-boggling that such decisions can be made by this kind of stuff.
You've actually just shocked me in the... Just Donald Trump looks at books. I mean, if you told me he saw some little segment on Fox.
What happened was he asked someone to find an expert on trade, and especially trade with China. And so this person searched on Amazon, right? Trade with China or something. And the first guy who popped up happens to be this person that's in charge of commerce now.
All right. Well, when this interview goes out, you'll be the first guy popping up on Amazon. We'll put your working paper out. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Well, it's been great to talk to you, Vincent. I think your green job guarantee proposal is going to fall on fertile ground by the sounds of it. When will it move from being a working paper to the next stage? The
reality is that mainstream economics is very strong in China, in universities and in the theoretical domain, in academics. So it's going to be a battle, right? It will be a battle. But, hopefully we will see work soon and someday. But if it doesn't happen anytime soon, I think it's also important to start planting the seeds. I also hope that the job guarantee, the Green New Deal, could work in the US, right? Because as we know, the US is beacon of the light, right? City on the hill that everyone looks up to. So if it starts doing something, maybe that, other countries will follow suit and say, oh, this is okay, we could do it. I kind of wish that the $3 trillion stimulus in the US could have included that job guarantee component, right? It would have been a very good opportunity given the rising unemployment rate. But we'll just have to see what happens in the next half a year or so.
Hopefully you can show us in the US and the UK how it's done, and then we can follow.
Oh, gosh. I don't think it's that complicated, right? If the U.S. could, hire so many of its people to get into World War II, it could also hire those people to rebuild its infrastructure, which is in terrible position right now. So plenty of things to do, and we know how to do it, just not doing it.
It's a no-brainer. Well, look, it's been great to talk to you, Vincent.
Yes.
We'll say goodbye for now. Thanks for your time and being so generous with your time.
Absolutely fascinating. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christian and Patricia. It's been great talking to you too.
Okay, thanks and bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
That was the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon starting at $1 a month and get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Editing and post-production was by Damien Caldwell. Thanks for listening.